This is Tony Franklin here. Well, where's he from? What was the firm? Jimmy Page and Paul Rogers? Back in the big head days. You just play that rock and roll with Joe Kay. Okay?
Oh yeah, just call me Joe, and I can play that rock and roll for you.
In 1967, he booked two fairly big gigs that came one right after the other. The first of these gigs was he played the 1967 Monterey Pop Festival. That is one of the quintessential 60s rock festivals, sort of like Woodstock or Altamont. And just 10 days after that festival, he had a gig backing up Chuck Berry on Chuck Berry's 1967 Live at Fillmore Auditorium album. Now, the story with that was Chuck Berry booked like a residency at the Fillmore Auditorium, and he needed a backing band. And because Steve, what was called the Steve Miller Blues Band, was sort of, the best up-and-comer, promoter Bill Graham reached out to Steve and asked him to play the gig. And of course, given that Chuck Berry was absolutely a legend at the time, Steve took him up on it. So the band backed up Chuck Berry, and Steve played guitar on all of the tracks, and he also played harmonica on a few of them. I'm going to play a clip of a song called It Hurts Me Too, because that's sort of a duet between Chuck and Steve, and I think that's really cool. So here is a clip of a song called It Hurts Me Too from Chuck Berry's 1967 Live at Fillmore Auditorium album.
When things go wrong, go wrong with you, it hurts me too.
So Chuck Berry died in 2017, and Rolling Stone reached out to Steve Miller and basically asked him to talk about this record for an article, because up until then there really wasn't a whole lot written about this record. You would think this would be a really interesting piece of rock history, as Chuck Berry was an icon of the era, and again Steve was this up-and-comer. It was like right before the release of his first album, but there's not a whole lot written about it, because the album's kind of meh. And I'm going to read to you a little bit from this article, and you'll see why. This is as read to Rolling Stone's Andy Green. It's a March 2017 Rolling Stone article. Steve says regarding Chuck Berry, "When I met him in 1967, we were like the band in the San Francisco scene that was able to back up the blues guys. Chuck had recently been in jail, and he was a fairly unhappy guy. Bill Graham came to me and said, 'Hey, we're bringing Chuck Berry out, and I want you and your band to back him up.' I said, 'Okay, I'll do it, but only if he'll come out here and rehearse for 2 days.' Graham did his magic, and Chuck showed up, and we just had this great time." So Mercury Records says, "This is great. We want to make a live album." And a deal was struck that afternoon, the day we were going to do the show. They brought in this funky little board to record it on. All of a sudden, this guy Abe Kesh shows up, who was the producer for Mercury. We're rehearsing and all ready to go when he takes Chuck Berry outside for 10 minutes before the show. Chuck comes back in, and he's almost unconscious, like he's in slow motion. So what Steve is talking about there, and he elaborates on this further in his interview with Howard Stern, 2016, is Chuck Berry, unfortunately, was a heroin addict. And the implication here is that he was on heroin during the recording of this album. And I think Steve sort of looks back on this record as a bit of a missed opportunity. Something that could have been really special, where Chuck and his band were playing really well in the practice sessions. Maybe they didn't play at 100% during the actual recording because Chuck was on the junk, and it slowed him down. So a few more quotes from this article here, elaborating more on his experience with Chuck Berry. Steve said, Chuck had the hardest time because I don't think he trusted anybody and he had such a hard life. But our shows at the Fillmore started the return of his career. We were backing Chuck and played all up and down the West Coast and East Coast at Paramount Theaters. We played a lot of gigs, but we finally had a fight. He got crankier as we went on doing these shows, and one night he started bad-mouthing the band on stage. We had 2 shows to do that night. We came off stage, and I said, Chuck, if you ever fucking do that again, you can get your own band, your own amp, your own stuff. You can't talk that way to my musicians on the stage, ever. He stopped it, and from that time on, we were great friends. It was an honor and a privilege to play with him. He had a long life, a peculiar life, a lot of problems. And then he goes on to talk about, like, you know, a lot of issues that Chuck Berry faced in his life. You know, this is still the era of segregation that really, really impacted black artists in negative ways, obviously. Chuck was mistreated horribly by Chess Records, which was his record label. I could do a whole show on, you know, what a miserable label that Chess Records was. And, you know, Chuck was not the most trusting of people, so he didn't have good management. He never got paid in the way he should have. So I think Steve looks back on this era and this collaboration with Chuck Berry is sort of bittersweet. He got to play with one of his heroes. They became friends. It was a great start to his career. But Chuck could be difficult to get along with. And, you know, at the time, he was, you know, on heroin and maybe not playing to the best of his abilities. So you could see why that would sort of be, you know, kind of good and bad for him.
For Mr. Chuck Berry, let's do it for the Steve Miller Blues Band also, huh, please?
Hope you're doing great, and best of luck with your new podcast, Rock the World with it.
Go, 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 Johnny, be good. Go, go, go.